If I may try, put on my best fullness for the voice here, calling you all to attention. Thank you so much for being with us this morning again. And, as I said, hello to everybody who has moved from presence to Zoom. So I know we've got a number of colleagues who couldn't join us in person, and a few more will be arriving shortly. So we wanted to continue this morning our discussion from yesterday. And if the containers yesterday were kind of over, you actually, I'm just going to do the chairing, are supposed to talk about the European Union in the time that we have, and Jonathan's contribution to rethinking European governance. And I will say European, not European Union governance, because the two things are not the same. And I think you've done, both, also kind of thinking about how European governance spills over in many ways at a variety of scales, the European Union. So we've asked the panelists, as yesterday, to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, something like that. And I will actually reverse slightly the order to give the word to our colleague Maria Weimer, who is on Zoom, just to make sure that that works, and then turn it over to you if that is okay. Yeah? All right. So Maria, do you want to begin, and we'll make sure that we can hear you properly?
Yes, thank you, Luiza. Can you hear me well now?
Yeah. Yes, Maria.
Perfect. Dear all, I have met Jonathan about 10 years ago when I was still a young postdoc. And during these 10 years, we have collaborated, have been colleagues, and I'd like to think friends. And so to quote Amy Verdun from yesterday, I am a little Jonathan in the sense that Jonathan's ways of doing things certainly had an impact on me. He is, and he has been, and he remains an important mentor for me. So today I'm very happy that I can sing some public praise to Jonathan and to his work. And I agree with all the things that were said yesterday about Jonathan. All of those wonderful things are true in my experience. And as we know from experimentalism, that is the only way to know. Jonathan is indeed a rare kind of a scholar. His intellectual force and his erudition, his academic passion and commitment, but also the kind of person that he is, open-minded, cool and nonchalant, kind and encouraging, and not holding grudges, even if you disagree with him. So his faith in reason and in the possibility of positive change, all of that has had a very important impact on my development as a scholar. And I'm extremely grateful to you, Jonathan, for that, although I cannot see you right now. And I notice that I would really like to look at you right now. So having said that, as a scholar of law and as a scholar of European law in particular, I'd like to take this moment to briefly reflect on the contribution of Jonathan's work on the field. And I will look a little bit to the past and a little bit to the future. So as I said, the first time I met Jonathan physically was in 2012. And it was not far from where you sit right now in the beautiful old center of Amsterdam. It was for a workshop that was preparing his second volume on experimentalism in the European Union, a volume that was analyzing the external dimension of EU governance. And so I was a young postdoc, and I was invited to contribute to that volume. And I was quite excited and honored because, of course, while this was my first personal encounter with Jonathan, intellectually, I have met him a long time before that. Because when I was entering the stage of EU legal academia, you know, as a PhD back in Florence in 2005, there was quite a rigorous debate taking place about the nature of European governance, and most importantly for me back then, the role of law in European governance. And Jonathan and Chuck Sable were the most active participants in this debate. And so as a young German scholar interested in interdisciplinarity and to some extent escaping the narrow confines of German doctrinal world, of the German doctrinal world, it was, in my view, one of the most exciting debates happening at that time. There was a real battle of ideas raging between old and new governance, between formalists and those who argued that EU law was a much more complex phenomenon, intertwining with social practices beyond traditional EU lawmaking, and an institution of morphing normativity, which ordered European society in ways that were both more challenging and more fascinating than the hierarchical images of top-down ordering through the community method and the classic rule of law accounts. But it was, of course, not a new battle of ideas in law, simply a reincarnation of all the debates about socio-legal studies, legal realism, critical legal approaches to the study of law, etc. However, in this European sequel, this debate was both new and it had a lasting impact on EU law as a discipline. It opened up the discipline in important ways that have paved the way for many other critical law in context approaches to the study of European law that we have seen emerging since then and that are still emerging, probably without being aware how much this openness of our discipline is indebted to these early debates about European governance. Today, to say that law cannot be studied in isolation is trivial. But the fact that it is trivial for us as EU law scholars to say that today is mainly due to the contribution of new governance scholars, and most prominently Jonathan. I remember in my PhD, I had a chapter on the notion of governance in EU legal studies. That was a question that we lawyers were fascinated with and to some extent confused. And I think I wrote in that chapter that I was not very convinced by the usefulness, by the analytical usefulness of this juxtaposition of old versus new and law and governance, but that actually the only people who bothered to develop a theory of governance were the experimentalists. And I think it is still true because today in EU law, we don't talk about new governance anymore. The study of soft law, of networks, of empirical processes underpinning lawmaking, all of that has become commonplace in our discipline. But experimentalism as a theory is still around. And just a word on how I see the relationship between experimentalism and law, because that was mentioned yesterday, there was a discussion about it. It remains an interesting question. I don't see these two as being in competition with each other because they are different categories working at different levels. And ideally, I think law should enlist experimentalism and experimentalism should enlist law for the joint purpose of enabling collective action and problem solving in the face of a lot of adversity. And this brings me to the question of where we stand today as societies facing unprecedented ecological and socioeconomic challenges and a highly uncertain future. The question of the possibility of collective action is key to our survival as a species today, particularly as we observe the relatively slow and ineffective ways in which our liberal representative democracies are addressing pressing problems. And by the way, let's remember that democratic experimentalism has begun as a critique of liberal representative democracy back then in the US context. Now, I will not go as far as to say that experimentalism will solve those challenges that we are facing today on its own. But I do think that it holds very important ideas and insights that we must keep in mind, such as the idea on how to organize collective action under conditions of polyarchy, heterogeneity, and uncertainty. The call to destabilize entrenched systems through bottom-up processes. And I think climate change governance is a very good example of this, becoming more and more important, and is in fact regarded as key in the way climate change is governed today and should be governed. And climate change litigation could perhaps be considered as part of this process of destabilizing entrenched systems. And lastly, the emphasis on experimentalists on the importance of local context and the empowerment of actors most affected by a problem so that they can own the solutions. So what I really like about experimentalism is this pragmatist tradition, most notably indebted to Joe Dewey, and thus firmly rooted in the progressive movement. It is, I think, highly topical today because it relies on the realization that there is constant change and the necessity to continually reassess and readjust our conceptual tools. And isn't that what scholars everywhere are doing these days, or should be doing? Rethinking and transforming. The older I grow, the more I appreciate the constructive outlook of this pragmatist tradition and its focus on seeking solutions without forgetting the importance of legitimate process. Experimentalism is sometimes accused of being uncritical, but I think this is a misconception. I have learned that people like Jonathan simply choose to put their attention elsewhere. Instead of asking what doesn't work, as many crits do, it asks what does, and it keeps on making that choice. I will end with a worry. I'm aware of the time, Luiza, thank you. So I will end with a worry of mine. And I'm hoping Jonathan, as always, can disperse it. I am worried about the problem of what Dewey has called inchoate publics. So publics whose members lack the critical education, time and attention necessary to learn and reason about problems which affect them. Under the current conditions of social inequality and polarization and digitalization, I think this is a pressing concern and challenge that affects both traditional representative democracy and democratic experimentalism. And I think that this is something that we still need to work on, Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I am going to also grab the microphone because I have a feeling that...
I'll want to speak without though.
Sorry,
You know what,
we'll just
we're trying to record this.
We're just going to put it at the bottom, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, that works, if that's okay.
Also, because I think it will be easier.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, actually, Francesco, I will let you
put it on the chair.
Next.
Okay.
Kind of reversing back to our original program.
All right, so my starting point today is quite close to Maria's one. So when I joined UBA in 2016, I was straight out of my PhD with a quite a lot of ideas which touched broadly upon issues of EU integration in different subfields, in economics, in political science. And I've heard Jonathan joking about it a number of times already, saying main doubts that he had about my candidature back then was indeed that I wanted to work all over the place. And I'm actually quite happy that at the end, Jonathan and Brian took the risk of bringing me here, because coming to UVA for me was a good shock, that allowed me to start linking together his interests all over the place and finding a silver lining, a red line, connecting these different issues. Now, yesterday and today, we heard two macro themes linking Jonathan's contributions throughout different fields, but also as an attitude. The first one is this struggle between determinism on the one hand and possibilism, possibilities for action on the other, but also a nice narrative that just opposes fatalism on one end and good outward-looking optimism about what is going on the other. And I think they have different collaborations that John and I have had so far, and we hope more, I think, touch upon both issues. This could have been problematic in a way, because when I came here with a training, which in good part was from macroeconomics, I wanted to look at macro aspects. I was interested on the socioeconomic forces that link together international governance, institutions, and the construction of polity as well. And of course, in part, Jonathan's suggestions was to switch more to an agent-based perspective, to look at how strategies evolved. Yet my interests, and in part our first collaboration, remains with crisis. And crisis affect these factors that I also think that interact with Jonathan's chief contribution to European studies, which is of course the application of experimentalist governance to the case of the European Union. Maybe you will correct me later, but I will say now a couple of things about how I see this interaction occurring between crisis and experimentalist governance, because I think that explains maybe a bit more what we have done together and also other areas of research. So in a way, experimentalist governance, in my reading, exists and thrives in a space which is created by two different forces. On the one hand, you have the need of jointly govern interdependence. And on the other, you have national governments and member states which are quite jealous about their autonomy. And these two forces create a space which is characterized fundamentally by a joint preference, I would say, for non-hierarchical modes of governance, and by a will of co-construct and collaborates toward issue-specific problem solving. And experimentalist governance, in the way it is presented, provides the optimal solution to these two particular sets of problems. So in these conditions, it thrives. And it also thrives when polarization is low. When political polarization is limited, experimentalist governance can deliver. Now, I think we'll start to see why crisis may unsettle this equilibrium, but also creates opportunities. They may unsettle the equilibrium because they create avenues for polarization and politicization, which may endanger the collaborative basis, which underpins, I think, experimentalist governance on the one hand, but also they constitute an opportunity because they create or they make manifest new forms of interdependence, to which experimentalist governance offers a solution to some extent. And I think on this interest on crisis, Jonathan and I had the first, I would say, real cooperation, although, of course, with different lenses. So I tried to bring attention to the socioeconomic constraints produced by crisis, and Jonathan was bringing it back to agent strategies, how to deal with that, how different actors behave in this context. I think that we found an equilibrium in our first special issue there. we both agreed at the end of the day to this reasonable optimism that the politics track was not. Now we could go out of it. We could find ways to ensure that the politicization and polarization was not destructive as others were fearing. And in our new, hopefully forthcoming collective work, a new special issue on polycrisis, we hope, at least I hope, to go back to this positive outlook and new ways of looking at how to escape the politics trap. Now, there is a second area, I think, and I'm actually almost done, so maybe we have time. So a second area where our interests have grown, although on a more parallel pathway, I would say, I think the study of public preferences through conjoint experiments. Now, Theresa first, and then Brian, me, Frank, and Jonathan, a bit almost simultaneously. I mean, in my case, because I was working in a project with them, but also intellectually, we discovered conjoint experiments as a way of studying public preferences. And in my opinion, there is no more Jonathan-like way of looking at public preferences than conjoint experiments. And let me explain why. Well, not just because we experiment in the name, but it really fits all the boxes, I think. First, conjoint experiments allow a non-dichotomous way of looking at public opinion. So in a way, they de-emphasize the inherent polarization that you would find in normal survey questions. Now, if you simply ask, do you support or oppose your country membership of the European Union? Well, of course, you will end up with a polarized result. Part will say I oppose, part will say I support. Conjoint experiments allow to skirt that inherent polarization and actually go more to the substance of the question. What do different people mean? Which forms of the European Union you would like to have? So it allows to avoid putting upon the public opinion a polarization which perhaps is not automatically there if we don't push them in that direction. Second, as much as you can, conjoint experiments are a form of deliberative instruments, almost. Respondents in a conjoint experiment see, compare, decide, and almost role play as decision makers. And this produces very different outcomes than simply ask a person a question you support or oppose. So it's almost an experimentalist way of thinking about public opinion. And by the way, this also speaks again to the theme of optimism, I think. In the work that Theresa, Brian, Frank, and I did, actually, we find out, and I think this is quite a constant throughout the conjoint experiment, we find out that once we account for policy variations, the fundamental Euroscepticism, fundamental opposition to European integration is really quite limited. It was between 6 and 7% of the respondents, which is a completely different picture than what you would get if you simply ask, do you support or oppose your country membership of the European Union? Only very few people have a fundamentally anti-European outlook. And this is, a reason for optimism. And finally, I think that conjoint experiments allow a full immersion, if you like, in the complexity of policy design. And I think I don't have to explain you why. Jonathan probably would find that an attractive way of looking at public opinion. Now, there is another element, I think, that makes conjoint experiments a good complement to experimentalist governance. That is, at least empirically, we found out in our research that questions of framing, questions of socioeconomic structure behind that introduce a conjoint experiment and difference in there are much less important in shifting public opinion than policy differences. Okay, so people react much more to the content of the policy than they do to the content of the framing, the structure that is introduced behind it. And this lends credibility to an approach that focuses rather on the policy content than on the structure around it. Now, speaking of agency, and let me conclude by saying that if I'm here today talking with you in an academic world which is characterized by hyper specialization and a preference for depth rather than width, it's because you know, Brian and Jonathan decided to take a gamble and you know, bring me here. So I would say I like that twist in possibilism, and I would be forever thankful.
I would say I really like this recurrence of possibilism and optimism. I think, you know, and also kind of thinking about the method necessary to make optimism possible, including, you know, conjoined experiments as a method towards a more optimistic understanding. Bridget, I will pass on to you as not only somebody who's known Jonathan for a very long time, but also somebody who's known Eckes for a very long time. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here to honor Jonathan, to celebrate his work and his contribution to institution building with this university. And institution building is a tough business. It's much easier to just go into an institution, you do your own work, but you don't pay attention to the legacy that the universities need institution builders, but the incentive structures in universities are not designed to reward institution builders. So I think it's a great testimony to Jonathan that not only has he contributed as a scholar to the creation of a scholarly community here, to the creation of the next generation of scholars, but also to leaving that institutional legacy, which will be built on. I would like to speak in two different senses. One, the affinity I feel for Jonathan's work and the collaboration I've had with him, and then his scholarly contributions. So firstly, the affinity I feel I've experienced in terms of his work on the EU, on how he approaches the study of the European Union. And I would say that the first characteristic is he doesn't look at the EU as a scaled-up version of the nation state. He doesn't use those benchmarks. I suspect he doesn't think that it is feasible or even desirable that that's the EU of the future. So he's never been a state builder in that sense, but he still regards the EU as a very viable polity. Nor does he think the EU is so sui generis or distinctive that it's an outlier. Rather, perhaps in the EU, the trends in governance are revealed more quickly because of the nature of the polity and the competences and the institutions. So I've always valued that. I've also always valued the fact that he has eschewed what I would call the binary or dichotomous approach to the study of the EU. There are so many very stale debates in the literature on the EU, where the EU is either this or that. It is intergovernmental or supranational. It is an IO or a political system. And he's never engaged at all with that. And I think that's very healthy because the EU is both and it. And so I think that's a very valuable part of his work. Also, that the experimentalism and the polyarchy. In 1999, I co-authored a book called Europe's Experimental Union. And the whole approach in the book was that there's a lot of experimentation in the system, not just of governance, but of institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm certainly in the experimentalist camp when it comes to the study of the EU. And then also in terms of method, because I think Jonathan is broadly inductive in his approach. He soaks and pokes. He follows the green shoots when something interests him. He looks for the patterns, for the scope conditions behind what is happening. And of course, all of that is theoretically informed. And then finally, he has always been someone who has reminded me and others of the role of actors. As late as a paper I gave in Miami in May, when he it was a paper on an institutional ecology, and he basically said to me, the actors are not there. Where are your actors? So I wrote at the top of the paper, actors, actors, actors. And it's a chapter of a book, and the chapter will be much strengthened because of the actor, actor, actor. So for all of that, I very much have always appreciated Jonathan's work. I've also really appreciated collaborating with him. When I arrived in Schumann in 2013, and I thought, how am I going to carve out some time for my own work? And I say this in the presence of Erik, who is now confronted with the same challenge. And I thought, well, what do I want to look at just now? And there had been, of course, this was the height of the Eurozone crisis. There was a lot of work that I too had contributed on the Eurozone crisis itself. But I felt we needed to take a step back to look at what else was happening in the EU system at the time in terms of politics, institutions, and policy, to see, was this the resilience question? Was the EU basically weathering not just the Eurozone, but were there lots of parts of the EU just carrying on as usual? And when I thought about it, we had two workshops, one a brainstorming and then one with our final papers. And when I thought about who I wanted in the room, I thought immediately of Jonathan. I said, I want to know, how is experimental governance dealing with the crisis? And is it proving to be also part of the solution? And he did a very fine paper that looked at financial regulation and also the socialization of the semester. And it was clear that yes, experimentalist governance was alive and well and was part of the solution. But it wasn't just his own paper, but the contribution he made through all of that process. And we produced a very nice special issue, a web special issue, Europe's Union Tested and Contested. And to have Jonathan in the room in terms of engaging with the other papers was so useful and so important. And then the second collaboration, more recent, was on our Horizon 2020 project on differentiated integration. And in fact, Jonathan was the father of that project because he, as one does, we were in the Teatro in the Badia in Florence at a conference, waiting in a queue for coffee. And Jonathan casually says to me, Bridget, have you thought about submitting a bid for the latest Horizon 2020 round? And I actually had a note on my desk at the time, look at that call. It was on my to-do list. And of course, I might never have got to that place on the to-do list. But after that coffee that morning, I went back to my office and thought, yes, we actually need to bid. We should bid. In fact, I did the first note on it that afternoon. So had Jonathan, I think, not prompted me, that work might never have happened. But more importantly, this was on differentiated integration. But one of the strengths of our bid was that we didn't just confine the consortium to differentiated integration, but rather we included two other work packages, one of which Jonathan led, on alternative ways that the EU has to address heterogeneity and diversity. And that was obviously experimentalist governance, but also flexible implementation. So again, it wasn't just that he kickstarted the process, but he also made a major contribution, and that contribution to the study and the work is continuing to come out. And then finally, I'm not sure this is a collaboration, rather I think in this case it was inspiration, but it went the other way, and that is that I gave a paper on the politics trap at the EUI, and Jonathan suddenly decided, yeah, interesting, and took it up, and that led to a very rich vein of work, and I hope to be part of the next phase in terms of looking at the strategic, how the EU, despite all of this, all of the limitations, how the EU can be strategic, and I look forward very much to that. So as a collaborator, he has been hugely important in my work, but also in collaborative work that I have produced. then, of course, the major contribution to date, but I do think the new work is really interesting, the politicization work, has been on EU experimentalist governance. And I think we should be very grateful to the Commission for establishing centres for EU studies in North America. But also we should be very grateful to the Schumann Center for Monet Fellowships, because if that, in a sense, recalibrated Jonathan from the scholar he was into a scholar who would devote a lot of attention to the European Union. And not just the theoretical work on experimentalist governance, but also the range of policy areas. Jonathan can really dig deep into an enormous range of areas, and he's extraordinarily comfortable with highly technical fields. So then let me, because I know we're going to hear from Jonathan, let me ask a couple of questions about experimentalist governance. And I'm not going to treat the legitimacy democracy part, because I think that's come up yesterday. So firstly, given that experimentalist governance is not one thing, but there are lots of different ways in which you have OMC, OMC plus, networked agencies, councils, the informal, the Florence Forum, etc., etc. Why is it, we know what the scope conditions for experimentalist governance are, but do we know what are the scope conditions for the emergence of different kinds of combinations of these sorts of processes? Is it policy? Is it problem, etc., etc.? So my second question is, how much do we know about what bites at domestic level? How much of it sticks? To what extent does it lead to the recalibration and reform at domestic level that is anticipated? And then what uses do domestic actors, how do domestic actors use the possibilities of experimentalist governance? So how much do we know about the how it hits home? And then this is more speculative, and that is, it strikes me that we're entering one important way in which the policy, the resource toolkit of the EU is changing is the use of public finance. Public finance has always been a very limited part of the EU, although I have argued in my own work that the budget has been extremely important. But we're now seeing much more use of public finance in the EU. The RRF is the prime example, but not just the RRF. The peace facility within 72 hours was used to buy weapons for Ukraine. And there's a lot of off-budget activity now. And I wonder how all of the discussion so far on experimentalist governance has been its relationship to law. But I'm wondering do we know anything, or is there any evidence of the relationship to public finance? At that, I will leave.
Thank you so much. And also, especially I think for raising these questions, which I'm sure there will be more questions from the audience, but I think thinking and taking us forward, certainly some of the thoughts that I would have in my mind as well. Erik, can I turn to you to, I won't say sum up, but to...
No. I mean, it's good. It's good that I'm here because I have a very different perspective. I mean, Jonathan and I did not meet as academics. We met as governance practitioners in the middle of the 1990s, working for the European Commission on a major initiative to push forward the European integration process. In other words, we were evaluators on a Framework 6 research package, right? Now, the reason I put it that way is because we didn't see ourselves as being working for the European Commission, but we were paid by them. We were instructed by them. We didn't really see ourselves as pushing forward the European integration process, but that's what framework packages were. We saw ourselves as just practitioners going in to do something that we really didn't know how to do, with procedures that we were only barely just introduced to. And the people who guided us were people who had played some role in writing those procedures, but didn't really know what they were doing either. And what we had to do was to go through the process of coming up with a way of evaluating research proposals, deciding what were the qualities that we wanted to highlight, making a decision and then deploying a huge amount of money on the back of that decision. That's experimentalist governance. We were practitioners in that process. And one of the weirdest things that came out of it was a real sense of appreciation for the quality of the paperwork. Because as we sat in there, whatever high-minded ideals we might have had, if the paperwork wasn't any good, we didn't have any sense of what the research proposal was going to do, and we couldn't evaluate it. And so it fell out of our governance process. The project that we picked was the Garnet project. The commission representative that was with us was Angela Liberatore. I stayed with the Garnet project throughout its life, and I can tell you it had a huge impact on the scholarly community in Europe. And yet I never saw myself as an agent of European integration in that process. What Jonathan has done, the brilliance of Jonathan's work, is that he identifies those agents of change across the governance process. He shows how they live in real life, right? And he describes them in ways that they can recognize. So in contrast to so many other literatures, I engage a lot with the literature on the role of ideas in public policy. I don't know any policymaker who would ever recognize themselves in that literature, right? They never sit around and go, crisis, crisis is a crucial turning point. No, they're like, I got to have something to do, right? And so I'm going to do something, and I'm going to do whatever seems to be best. But of course, what is best is always contested, right? The menu of options depends on who's in the room. And it could be just completely contextual. Now, the interesting thing about this description that Jonathan has to offer is that it's constantly mutable, right? I went back in preparation for this and looked at the work on open method of coordination architecture, European governance. But of course, it was a failed architecture, right? Just like the framework projects were failed architectures. So we replaced them with something else. I could imagine a whole paper by Jonathan on the socialization of Horizon Europe, right? Looking at how they use this new instrument in order to bring a different form of interdisciplinarity into the research management process. You would all recognize that. But that's how it works. And then we get to the end of it, and we realize it's not adequate. We need something else. Now, this is a very powerful understanding of how Europe is knitted together. Why? Because, and I'll boil it down to 5 principles. Because first, Europe is the context. It's not the goal. If you're looking for European integration, don't look for Europe, right? Look for something else. It's something else that's going on inside Europe. And that something else is improving public policy making it better. But of course, when we say we're going to make public policy better, just like when Jonathan and I were in the room evaluating those Framework 6 proposals, we have to figure out what the goal of the public policy is, and that's contested. And then we have to figure out what's better, and that's contested. And then we have to figure out how we're going to measure these things and their achievement, the quality of the paperwork. And then we have to figure out how we're going to make a decision and deploy scarce resources, right? And in effect, that's what European integration is, right? Now, when I say that's what European integration is, one thing I should underscore, and this is the 3rd principle. The 2nd principle is that the goal is better public policy. The 3rd principle is policy making is public policy. And so you have to operationalize the procedures as a policy itself. And so when you think about experimentalist governance, the true genius of it is that it allows us to focus attention on making more robust procedures to guide better policy. Because we know we're going to fail on the policy output, we need robust procedures that allow us to change how we make the policy to make it more effective, right? And so when you add those 3 things together, the context, the policy, the procedure, then you get to introduce real human agency, right? Human agents who are not stupid, who are not ideological, but who are human, who make mistakes, who have limited heuristic capacity. And yet who recognize themselves in this procedure. I'll give you a good illustration of the not stupid, but truly human story that doesn't come from Jonathan's work, but just came from a chance encounter I had with Giulio Tremonti, the old Italian finance minister, right? And I was sitting at a dinner with him because the chair of the Aspen Italia, and he's trying to sell to me that he's a safe pair of hands. And he says, he says, look, in 2003, France and Germany had a problem. They were caught in an excessive deficit procedure. And in that procedure, as you work through the paragraphs of that procedure, you get to a paragraph where you face legal jeopardy. And they have to vote, just like the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, they have to vote to move the procedure to that phase and then face legal jeopardy. And so Tremonti looked at me and he said, and of course we couldn't do that. So I helped them to create a different procedure that allowed them to escape legal jeopardy. And they took that and it worked, right? Now, what's important about this? First, there was no procedure for creating that procedure. We learned that from the European Court of Justice the following July, when the European Court of Justice said what you did was unlawful, right? But nobody cared. Second, this is a totally believable story. An Italian tax lawyer helps his French and German clients get out of legal jeopardy by inventing a loophole, right? And yet, that's a crucial moment in the history of European integration that we have to understand if we're going to understand the evolution of the Stability and Growth Pact that took place thereafter and all of the macroeconomic procedures that were built on top of it. That's the kind of thing that you get out of this experimentalist governance narrative. Recognizable human agency that makes mistakes and fix it even if the solution is not an elegant one in the first instance. And that brings me to the last point, and then I'm going to give you some advantages and disadvantages. The last point is integration may or may not happen as a consequence of all this activity. So it's not a teleological understanding of European governance. And that's why it's not European Union experimentalist governance. It's European experimentalist governance because it sits in a context, and we're not sure if the European Union is actually going to be the end result, right? The solution may be more inelegant than that. Lord knows, Jonathan has spent enough time describing institutions that exist outside the treaty framework. And so what are the advantages and disadvantages of this approach? I think the disadvantages are the ones that are obvious for all of us to see. It's very hard to formalize this kind of analysis, right? It's very hard to collect the data. Jonathan's papers are bewilderingly detailed, right? And I'm not a detail guy. So every time I read it, I'm always have to stop and take notes and try to figure out. The data collection is so painstaking. You have to talk to so many people. Fortunately, Jonathan likes to talk to people, right? And the people who work with him like to talk to people. But it's a painstaking effort, particularly when you know, and this is the third disadvantage, that the portability of insight across time or context may not be all that great. The open method of coordination doesn't really look all that much like the European semester, which doesn't look all that much like what the European Commission is doing right now. There are similarities, they rhyme, but the insights may not be perfectly portable from one to the next. So it's a lot of effort and data collection that may get you to a place where you feel like, okay, well, I have a great insight, but I'm not sure what to do with it anymore. Those are the disadvantages. What are the advantages? This recognizable human agency thing, I think, is vital. When Jonathan says, look, even people in the Commission have adopted the socialization of the European semester as a concept. Of course they have. They recognize themselves in it. How many of them have adopted neo-functionalism as a context, right? They don't recognize themselves in that, or liberal intergovernmentalism. Nobody recognizes themselves in that, right? So in that sense, it's actually a communication of insight that's much more effective than the theoretical debates that we tend to have. The second is that it's a much more optimistic vision of Europe, right? Even when Jonathan says, look, I'm a little bit afraid of the recovery and resilience plan because there are all these automatic things that are going to happen, and you don't do this, you don't get your money type thing. My sense is, getting back to that principle, the fourth principle, that people are not stupid, they just won't do it, right? And the insight I have from that comes from Paul de Gouwe. I remember sitting at a panel with him in 2001, where he was talking about the Stability and Growth Pact and the possibility of automatic sanctions coming in. And Paul said, that will never happen. Germany and France will never allow themselves to be sanctioned. And so I wrote that into my book on the politics of economic and monetary union as my brilliant insight, because everything Paul says is brilliant and I wanted it to be mine. And that is the best prediction I made in that book, right? Which is that they would not allow themselves to be sanctioned. And I don't think that the recovery and resilience plan was designed to fail. I think it was designed to do the best they can in the context, and when the context changes, they'll change the thing to make sure that it keeps working. This kind of pragmatism that Maria talked about, I think is very important. And the insights that Jonathan has to offer about how to build that kind of pragmatism into the policy process, I think is vital. We need much more attention to be paid to policy design. And this is my last point. I actually think that for all the bewildering detail, Jonathan's understanding of European governance is easier for me to explain to flesh and blood individuals than any other understanding that I've encountered. I can actually convince people that this is a good idea. And Europe needs easy explanation because the guys on the other side of the debate about European governance are not really interested in good public policy. And they've got a great story to tell people about how they can make things worse and get the turkeys really to vote for Christmas along the way. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for that, Erik. And yes, we desperately need different narratives because the narratives on, as you say, the other side, and I think we can all imagine, you know, what you're talking about, are very simplistic and very appealing as well. So I think, you know, kind of an appreciation of the complexity, but also recounted differently. It's really, really crucial also politically, not just academically. So I don't know if any of you want to react to each other, if we can open it up to the floor. I know we have people on Zoom. I don't know if we will be able to bring them in, but let's look to the room. Does anybody want to jump in? Yeah, David.
Maybe a question to Erik about the RF you just mentioned. You said the RF is not allowed to fail, and so the Commission might be adaptable, might be more flexible, but the region framework shows such fun, but feels in the eyes of whom? Because the expectations are, of course, very different. And maybe in your answer, you can also reflect on the change of government, what we can expect, the amount of space for renegotiation, and whether it's smart of the Commission to be more flexible and to adapt this more rigid framework.
Shall we take maybe one more? Brian, I saw you had a hand up.
Luiza, may I ask, I don't know, other people using microphone because I have a hard time hearing what people say in the...
Yeah, of course. Actually, Brian just very kindly brought the mic back here, but I will let him speak into the mic and then we will...
Hi, it's Brian talking, and I'm going to try to talk in a place where I don't set off the interactions or the feedback. So I have, the work on experimentalism and Jonathan's contributions to that are actually his sort of anchor role in that, starting with the open method of coordination work and then all through the work he's doing today, and that I think every one of you has recognized as one of his major, maybe his key way of sort of rethinking how the EU functions as a political and an economic and institutional entity. That has always taken place in the shadow of various aspects of what you could call democratic distemper. So when Jonathan first came to our department, one of our colleagues, a quite beloved colleague, was Chris Bickerton. And Chris's big point, for anybody who knows his own work, is one of his big points is that, well, you know, for all the hatreds and xenophobia that we might associate with sort of Brexit politics, Euroscepticism generally, there is something about the embrace of democratic representation and a sense of political autonomy that undergirds the skepticism, and that should be taken seriously in a way. And this turned out to be a conversation between Jonathan and Chris in many ways, where your conception, Jonathan's conception of experimentalism, in various ways was basically a retort to that conviction that I just summarized. I put that in Chris Bickerton's shoes, but it's more general. But let me say that now in 2022, I'm still interested in that question. So I want to know how all of you see your own sense of experimentalist governance as a theoretical matter that you yourself might describe and embrace. and or as a theoretical position that you think is Jonathan's, and ultimately more your Jonathan's perspective, I want to know how can we square the experimentalist mode with that same movement of anti-elite, anti-establishment, anti-institutional form that we associate with this kind of the current moment of polarization, but particularly a movement, what we'll call populist movements, that seem inimical to this sort of form of governance that I associate with experimentalism. How can we make experimentalism safe for the age of populism is another way of asking my question. But generally, I'm interested in that exchange. And I want to be clear, it's not about per se the way Chris would like to have put it, which is that, oh, it's about the democracy quality. To me, there's something much more going on about populism and position about elites, where experimentalism can accept the idea that there's expertise that requires a certain kind of elite. Ideas about the process of governing that we associate with experimentalism, which involves back and forth and learning, it does seem kind of inimical to some of the broad stroke gut politics we associate with populism. So anyway, I want to hear what you all think about this. Like, how can we square the future and possibility of experimentalism with our populist age?
Thanks so much. And actually, I think we can tie the two questions very nicely together. I don't know about a prediction for the next Italian government, and Giulio Tremonti will be back, as we were just joking about.
Oh, he'll be back.
Oh, he'll be back. He's always back. I don't know who wants to take a stab at that. Erik, do you want to? We can start from the back.
Sure, David. I didn't say the recovery and resilience plans won't be allowed to fail. I said that they weren't designed to fail. I mean, I hope they won't be allowed to fail, and I think it would be crazy for them to set out to fail them. But I think you identified the salient point, right? Which is that the people are human who are enforcing these programs, and humans have likes and dislikes. Hemerijck has that beautiful book that he's written that shows that when the Five-Star Movement and the Lega were in government, the European Commission treated them very differently from the way they treated the PD. And if they do that same trick again with the government of Fratelli d'Italia and Lega and whatever's left of Berlusconi, right? then I think bad things could happen, and that makes me nervous, right? Having said that, you know, when my research collaborations with Jonathan have historically failed. Because I've never been good enough to meet the standard. And the most important of these was a paper I did for Jonathan on politicization. And in the politicization paper, what I did was say, look, you know, we understand the politicization of Europe as two different mechanisms. One that's based on Lisbeth Hoch and Gary Marx's work, the post-functionalist theory, but one that's based on Peter Mayer and Stefano Bartolini's work, which is all about anti-elites. And if we believe in Peter Mayer and Stefano Bartolini and reject the Hoch and Marx, then what we should expect is that these populist parties that Brian is talking about will only be anti-European when it suits them. And they will stop being anti-European when it suits them. And you know what? The Five-Star Movement stopped being anti-European in May 2019. The Lega stopped being anti-European in February 2021. Fratelli d'Italia stopped being anti-European in July. And that's because it doesn't suit them to be anti-European. When they've got all that money on the table, nobody's going to leave that money on the table. So if we can just get Giulio Tremonti in to save us, right, then I think Brian's problem will be solved, because the politicization won't emerge and experimentalist governance will rule the day.
I don't know about Giulio Tremonti saving Europe.
Very optimist, but a bit deterministic account of how things would work. I'm afraid. But
Francesco, do you want to follow on?
No, on Brian's question, I think that a big part of populism, more than rejection of elite politics on the input side, is dissatisfaction with output. And experimentalist governance, when done well, acts, especially on the output side, can provide a better policy outcomes. And this provides an answer to the output legitimization component behind populism. It doesn't solve the issue completely, but as I was saying during my short intervention, I think that the input side, the fundamental polity criticism, is limited, and a lot of it comes from output concentration.
Brian's excellent question. I think in terms of populism and European integration, so firstly, I think I'm not sure I would accept the broad title, we live in an age of populism. We certainly live at a time when populist politics has more traction than it has in the past. But I think we need to be careful. I think there's a tendency now to read all democratic politics off the populist playbook. And I just think that's not the reality out there. Secondly, on the relationship between populism and European integration. So most populist parties are anti-EU, but I think they're anti-EU in the marketplace. It's part of the market. It's part of the competitive marketplace that, as Erik said, when it suits. But you tend then to get when in government they certainly it's more muted, because governing in Europe today involves the European Union. And we have the living experiment of Brexit that shows us what happens when you try and disengage from deep interdependence. So again, I think that's, but I do think that sometimes populism and European integration is a subtext for populism and migration. And being anti-EU is a more polite version of really being anti-migration. So I think we need to look at that very carefully. And then the broader, the experimentalist governance and the democratic quality. I think the politics in the EU, it's a complex system because there are two unions. There's a union of states that really matters. In other words, all those institutions, Council, European Council, and then there's a union of peoples, the sort of European Parliament track. What I think I see happening in Europe is more transnational politics than I've observed before. And I was quite struck during the lead up to the RRF decision, the amount of transnational politics that was visible in Europe, the number of multiple bilateral meetings between heads of government, but also prime ministers like Mark Rutte, not just talking to the Dutch people, but he wanted to talk more generally in Europe. But equally, Conte was, he was writing op-eds. And so I do think that although transnational politics is not favored by the structures at the moment, I think there's more of it. And I think it's something that we should watch. And I certainly would be in favor of introducing elements of transnationalism where possible, like transnational lists. And I would also favor, and I always have, the direct election of the Commission President. Just to, again, Mr. and Mrs. Europe. So I do think that there is room for experimentation also in terms of politics in the EU. And again, I'm always very struck that Europe's political leaders have been very experimental for the establishment of the single currency. That's a big bet. But political leaders have been a lot more reticent about experimenting with politics because that's their business. But I do think there's room for much more experimentation in the system.
And thank you for saying that. I think both, because I agree on both fronts, we're really actually talking about migration rather than talking about the EU or what the EU does. And unfortunately, there's various code words for fears of migration or any other kind of demographic fears. But also this question of, the sort of experimentation that maybe we don't see, we don't call experimentation. I mean, I think of to my mind, still disappointing process of the Conference on the Future of Europe and what came out of it, but a lot of those discussions, and maybe we're not, under that rubric, but that conversation is very much taking place. Maria, I wanted to turn to you. So, we haven't forgotten you, even though you're not with us. in-body. Would you like to add anything to these answers to respond to these first two questions?
Well, thank you. I don't have a lot more to add because I think that the other speakers already covered a lot of ground, but I do share Brian's concern, I wanted to say, and my worry that I expressed at the end of my little speech about the ability of publics to reason about the problems that concern them, in a way is a reference to that, a concern about oversimplification of narrative, populist accounts. And I do think that this problem is something that challenges both systems of political representation and experimentalism as a theory. And I don't think that experimentalism, let me put it positively, I would like experimentalism to engage more with that challenge. And I think it started doing that by engaging with literature on politicization and ways in which experimentalism and politicization interact. And lastly, I just wanted to say that sometimes the risk, particularly for experimentalism, is that while it creates these recursive systems of reasoning, bottom up, it fails for one reason or another to break down epistemic hierarchies. So in other words, that it reinforces a sort of a technocratic understanding of problems. I think that is something where a lot of attention should be directed to how to break down also not only power hierarchies, but also the narrative of the dominant narratives, let's say, of certain economic or other ideas that exclude people. Yeah, so that is what I would want to add to that.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, one more question and then we'll let you respond, Jonathan. Natasha, go ahead. Yeah, I think the microphone may be a good idea there.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your work. I just have fairly briefly, I guess, question. So I'm not that much into the field, so if I make a mistake there, I apologize. But my observation of EU policymaking is that while it increasingly uses experimentalism inwards when it comes to policymaking within the EU, it seems to be very scared to use experimentalist governance towards outside countries, but when it comes to membership. So we seem to see increased benchmarks and sort of skepticism and fear for having states join the EU and not changing the membership policies, for example, the unanimity or just increasing benchmarks. And what that leads to is basically shaking of the legitimacy of the EU towards the member state, towards the candidate states that cannot become members for so long. So my question is, how far can we push experimentalist governance within the EU or by the EU when that would lead to increased selective application of the experimentalist governance, and what then that leads to the legitimacy of the EU as a global actor?
Much for that, and I'm sure Jonathan will have a response to that. We haven't really had kind of conversations, you and I, about EU geopolitics and experimentalism, only kind of oblique ones. I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say, but I don't know if any of the panelists want to jump into that. Erik, yeah.
It's Natasha, right? So I just published a paper in JEP with a colleague, Veronica Angel, where we went back through the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, and we found something very surprising, which was the extent to which at each successive European Council summit, and we identify the key milestones along the way, they change the goals, they change the process, and they change the measure of success. And these changes actually accumulate toward the end. So by 1999, they have a much different enlargement process than anyone imagined at the start. And that's really surprising. And after 1999, the pressure of the security imperative gets them over the line, and they have this huge historic enlargement, including making commitments to Bulgaria and Romania that are totally unprecedented and that have never actually been achieved on the Bulgarian and Romanian side, right? Which is why they're still in cooperation and verification mechanism, right? And then it stopped when the security imperative lifted. But now the security imperative is back again. And so what do we think is going to happen? I think the flexibility available for the Western Balkans has just increased by orders of magnitude. And we just need to figure out how that's going to manifest. But the political will is revealing itself. And the only thing that could really screw it up, right, is Vučić basically deciding to throw himself into the pockets of Putin. And then what do we do, right? But I think that the possibilities that you are looking for are there.
Yeah, I think Ukraine is a game changer in terms of enlargement. There was enlargement fatigue in the system, but also because of the rule of law crisis with Hungary and Poland, there is also inside the EU the costs and consequences of enlargement. And that's been internalized in the system. And there is a deep concern about the readiness of countries, because what we've learned is that you can have all the conditionalities in the world on countries coming in. But once you have the seat at the table, that the treaties don't protect the Union at all and the other member states. And so I think that it is very legitimate for the EU to take a very serious look at those dimensions. I also think that state capacity really matters to countries coming in, because being a member state of the EU is very demanding on your state. And there is a tendency in particular, and most enlargements have involved smaller and poorer countries. And I come from one of those, from Ireland. It was poorer. And there is a tendency to think that the date of membership is the date, that once you get into the system, all your problems just simply ebb away. But the reality of even membership is it's a very tough system, it's a very competitive market. And unless you're able to take advantages of the opportunities of membership, then it's not going to be a good story. And we can see across all new members, there's a big study to be done, in my view, of the success, the use to which countries have put their membership and how successful. But I do think Ukraine is a game changer, and I do think there will be flexibility, and there could even be quite a significant move in terms of what membership would mean and how countries assess different elements of membership. But I think that's an open agenda now, and none of us should or could predict where that takes us. But I would say that it's much more likely that, say, countries of the Western Balkans, Ukraine, will be members on a cycle. But it's really important. If the EU just brings in more instability, then that's really dangerous for the EU, but also for the stability of Europe. So there's a balance there. I also think historically all countries have come into the EU when they're not fully prepared, the poorer ones. The question is, are they prepared enough to crack membership? And I think it's a very difficult assessment.
Thank you for that. And I know, I certainly would like to keep going with this discussion, but we want to give Jonathan a chance to respond, also to stick to our schedule. I see you're prepared already.
No, I just have a quotation I want to read out.
Do you want to come?
Yeah, I'll come forward. Maybe I should just pick up the chair and join.
And join us on the stage.
So because I'm going to give a substantial talk in a few minutes, I'm going to be relatively brief, and I would like to have responded to the very interesting questions that Bridget raised. But I think I'm just going to focus on the democracy, legitimacy, polarization issue, which is what I think exercises a lot of people, and also is not something I'm going to primarily talk about in my talk. Let me say first, though, that I agree with much, if not most, of what has been said by the four speakers, and it's really a pleasure to hear people from whom, in different ways, I've learned a great deal. Francesco and Maria, through direct collaboration, Bridget and Erik from their work, and the politics trap, as Bridget said, inspired Francesco and me in framing our special issue on integration and politicization. We recruited Bridget as a co-author of the introduction to recognize that contribution. And I think it's also worth mentioning, Bridget mentioned her book from 1999, is that, or 2001, Europe's Experimental Union, one of whose co-authors was Rory O'Donnell, later the director of the Irish National Economic and Social Council, and a close collaborator of Traxable. So the experimentalist affiliations are there as well. And from Erik, I would say, I recall meeting you first here in Amsterdam when Jeffrey and Brian invited you, and your perspective on understanding the Euro crisis and the centrality of the financial dimension. That's it was very important in my own thinking. I have to say, I don't recall this. Maybe I had another avatar, but I don't think I was involved in the evaluation of the Garnet project. We should go back to our notes. Maybe I did this and forgot it, but very, 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 very interesting. Okay, so the democracy, legitimacy, technocracy, epistemic authority issues are very thorny, very challenging. Nobody has worked them out. But here too, in many respects, I'm more optimistic, and that for a number of reasons. Actually, Francesco has articulated some of those reasons. So one reason is that I think that actually legitimacy and effectiveness go together. So you can only have effective policies and governance systems in an experimentalist sense, and I think Maria alluded to this as well, if you are really able to get the perspectives and knowledge of the people on the ground who are directly affected by those policies. And the experimentalist recursive cycle has to go all the way down to the face of ground level implementation of policies, and has to then go back up, bringing the perspectives of those people who were involved in implementation, but are also affected stakeholders. Otherwise, the recursive learning cycle cannot work. And so to the extent that that is what's required for legitimacy, then legitimacy and effectiveness are not in tension with each other, but are actually two sides of the same coin and mutually reinforcing. I would also say that, as regard, I agree with what Francesco said about conjoined survey experiments. And I would say that's something that I have learned here at the UvA. I mean, Frank started it with Brian and and Theresa and Francesco, and then I had the idea that we could apply this to a different area of risk regulation, and Maria and Theresa and David van der Douwen were involved in that. And I was very pleasant. I've never worked with surveys, with experiments, with quantitative analysis. I was very surprised pleasantly by how much it could simulate, the realistic challenges of policymaking and get individual randomly chosen representative citizens to deliberate about it and come up with extremely reflective and sensible reactions. And as Francesco mentions, we see that on, a whole series of different policy issues, especially where here in Amsterdam, different people associated with ACEs have done conjoined experiments. We could call that massively parallel individual deliberation. Now, the capacity for people to come up with sensible reflections on policy choices in the isolation of sitting in front of their computer screen makes one more optimistic about what would happen if you bring them together really to deliberate. And experiences like the Irish debate on abortion and similar things lead one to think that deliberative mini-publics, including the Conference on the Future of Europe, have a lot to offer. And so let me basically conclude by saying that I think there's a real crisis of representative democracy and representative government at many levels. And, I find, let's say, the views of somebody like Chris Pickerton to be romantic nostalgia to the extent that as a left Brexiteer, a Lexiteer, policy decisions are experiments, then we can also test the results and see, how is that actually working out? But where I think that the potential action is, and I don't want to say that legislatures and elections have no place. That's not at all my view. I want to quote John Dewey, whose ideas in The Public and Its Problems are really taken up and elaborated in a very interesting way in the new book by Zeitlin and Victor on Fixing the Climate. And they quote a famous sentence, which I believe very deeply in, from The Public and Its Problems, that it's the citizen who knows best where the shoe pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied. And so they articulate that to a vision of collaboration between ordinary citizens and experts in solving problems. And that process can also, with some capacity building support, can lead, I think, to overcoming some of the concerns that Maria expressed. I do think that above all, people care about having the problems that concern them solved or addressed in a meaningful way. And that is, if you like, the most convincing response to populism.
Thank you very much for that response. And to me, at least, a convincing response to populism as well, not just to the question. So I will be fierce here. I know there were some other hands up, but let's stop here. You will have plenty of chances to ask Jonathan at least more questions and just throw out some more general questions in the next session. So we have about 15 minutes now for a coffee break in the usual place or outdoors if you wish. I know some of you have to run off now, so thank you for being with us, and to be continued. So let's reconvene in about 15 minutes.
Yeah, good. All right. Fine.
Yeah. So we have, of course, in this last moment of our symposium, in a sense, most important moment, which is to hear Jonathan's take on his own research and thinking about the themes that we've been talking about as a group for the last 3 sessions, and also in the context of Frank Vandenbroucke's address. It's going to be a joy to hear what Jonathan is up to, what he wants to change and continue in his ongoing research in the coming years, coming decades. And he's going to speak for about 45 minutes. That's the expectation. So we will listen, and we want to have enough time to have some questions for him. We also are trying to make sure we get out of here, get out of this room by 12:45, no later. I have a class where students will be waiting for me at 1 o'clock, and if I don't show up, they'll probably throw things at me since I have all this very strict attendance requirements. So we're going to really adjourn at 12:45. We don't have much by way of closing other than to thank people for participating. So it's by far the most important thing that we use the time that we have to hear Jonathan's claims about his social inquiry, and then we use that as a moment to talk to him, have some exchange. So I think we just need to go until about 12:25, 12:30. Well, I should say, Jonathan, I'm going to cut you off before you get to 12:25, so that we at least have 20 minutes to have a question and answer, and then just a couple of minutes to say goodbye to everybody. So it's really, this is a time to hear your story. So without further ado, it's now 11:26.
Okay.
I will put up my hand when I think you need to try to stop within 5 minutes or something like that. But you're going to be in charge of the question and answer with us, if that's okay with you. So,
thanks.
Jonathan, take it away.
Thank you. Okay, well, let me begin, first of all, again, by thanking the organizers, Brian, Luiza, Theresa, and John, for putting this wonderful event together. I guess I surprised myself also by the higher level of tolerance that I might have expected for hearing nice things said about that. We find a lot of those, and I appreciate that. Okay, let me begin with a caveat. As Brian said, you know, I had declined the opportunity to give a traditional Afscheidscollege, that is a valedictory lecture for those who don't speak Dutch, and that for 2 reasons. One, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not saying goodbye to anyone, least of all to academia. And secondly, because the Afscheidscollege is, for me, part of the practice of mandatory retirement, which I consider to be in a literal sense, a legally tolerated form of age discrimination, and I didn't want to contribute to its legitimation by giving such a lecture in the aula with the deans and rector and so on. So I'm much happier here in this you know, sort of virtual but also real space where friendship and intellectual exchange is the real medium. Okay, and I was a little alarmed when I saw the program 2 weeks ago, and I saw that there was an hour and 15 minutes for my talk, and I was really not sure what I would do. And we talked, Brian and I talked about, oh, well, should it just be informal remarks? But then some of my younger colleagues and collaborators made it clear to me that they expected more. So the 2 phrases that we used were that people want to hear some of the key takeaways from the work I've been doing over the past few years, and also would like some guidance for the future, or at least my thoughts on where research in this area is going. So I wound up preparing a fairly expansive and ambitious talk. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. Okay, and I've called it Researching Experimentalist Governance. It was called Transformative Governance on the program, but you ought to be surprised to hear that, you know, I think that experimentalist governance is inherently transformative, and that all transformative governance worthy of the name is also experimental. So now I'm going to try to coordinate looking at my slides on the iPad in front of me and advancing them on the screen behind me through using the clicker. But if I get derailed, if they're just let me know. It's not ideal. Okay, so there. Now I'm holding the thing right way up. It's going. Okay, so the plan of the talk is pretty simple. It's in 3 parts. The first is a kind of introductory overview of, let's say, the theory of experimentalist governance. I think this will be familiar to many, but really not all of people in the room and online. Secondly, I want to talk about some of the theoretical and empirical extensions, which is really very much the work that I and others have been doing, let's say, over the past 10, 12 years since I came to Amsterdam, and then to look forward to research challenges and strategies. And I will, you know, not only look back, but look forward throughout the talk. So just to set the stage, you know, one of the claims that I and others have been making for some time is that we have seen the widespread emergence of a novel form of experimentalist governance, and that we can see this across multiple levels and locations within and beyond the nation state, and in terms of policy domains, running the gamut from the provision of local public services like education and youth care to the regulation of global trade, things like food safety, forestry, the protection of the ozone layer, and so on. And we find robust examples in many jurisdictions. The ones that have been best studied are in the EU, the US, and transnational regimes. I think it's also worth underlining that the same kind of governance structures and architectures can also be found in private, even for-profit organizations. And Gary has done some wonderful work on manufacturing multinationals and how they implement a version of experimentalist governance. Now, experimentalist governance in this sense can be understood as a widespread response to turbulence and uncertainty. So here the idea is that the increasing complexity and volatility of the decision-making environment leads to a reduced capacity of actors to anticipate future states of the world and calculate the consequences of their actions, even in a probabilistic sense. And this is what you know, was coined by Frank Knight, and it's now in terms of the distinction between risk, which is probabilistic, and uncertainty, which is genuinely unknowable. We talk about that in terms of Knightian uncertainty. And, you know, I'm not going to dwell on the reasons for this. That would be a whole nother lecture, but we can talk about the interactions between globalization, accelerated technological innovation, the diversification of populations and households, and other interconnected developments. And the important thing here is that these conditions have overwhelmed the capacity of conventional hierarchical governance in many settings, which really depends on stability and predictability. And so this world of Knightian uncertainty is one in which precise policy goals and the methods of achieving them can't be determined or fully determined in advance, but instead must be discovered and elaborated in the course of practical problem solving. Now, we can understand experimentalist governance as a recursive process based on a kind of iterative formulation and revision of framework goals, plans, and rules, and this through learning from comparative review of implementation efforts in different local contexts. And by recursion here, I'm referring to a concept which is originally derived from mathematics and computer science, in which the output from one application of a procedure or operation becomes the input for the next. And as you iterate the process, it produces novel or changing results. We can also see experimentalist governance as a form of pragmatism in action. We've already had quite a lot of references to Dewey and American pragmatism. So I would say that the governance processes of this type are experimental and experimentalist in a specifically philosophical sense, which derives from Dewey and American pragmatism. I would be happy to be a fruit on the extended or branch on the extended Deweyan tree, even if as John kindly said, maybe we bring something also new to that tree. And so in what sense is it experimentalist, is it pragmatist? First of all, it systematically provokes doubt about its own assumptions and practices. It treats all solutions as provisional and corrigible. It uses the local knowledge of frontline actors to correct higher level goals and rules, and a kind of broader horizontal or also vertical review of their efforts to correct local plans in light of experience elsewhere. In that sense, it's neither top-down nor bottom-up. And what this does is to produce an ongoing reciprocal adjustment of ends and means through comparison of different approaches to advancing common goals. Now, in its classic and most developed form, experimentalist governance typically involves a cycle of 4 functional steps or elements organized as an iterative, scalable, multi-level architecture. And this is a good moment to say that this kind of framework was inspired by and developed with Jack Sable, but also by him with other collaborators like Michael Dorff and Bill Simon. And here you see this classic iterative multi-level architecture in which at first you have central and local units of different kinds that can be public and private. They often involve a wide range of stakeholders from civil society. They jointly establish framework goals and metrics. This already depends on some previous work of defining a common problem and establishing a thin consensus about how to address it. And then in the second step, you have broad discretionary implementation by lower level units who can be public, private, or hybrid. And they contextualize the basic approach in relation to their local circumstances. And thirdly, we have regular reporting by these lower level units, participation in peer reviews where their efforts are compared to other comparable units, and where they're not making good progress towards the common goals by the agreed metrics, then the lower level units are expected to come up with plausible plans for improvement, which are informed by the examples of their peers. And finally, based on the problems and possibilities that are revealed by these peer reviews, we have a periodic revision of the overarching goals, metrics, and procedures. And so this is why it's shown as a cycle or ideally as an upward spiral of continuous elaboration and improvement. Now, these experimentalist architectures are often underpinned by what have been called penalty defaults, and we can simply present that as mechanisms for inducing reluctant parties to cooperate in this process by threatening to impose sufficiently unattractive alternatives. Now, in the EU, penalty defaults frequently involve court judgments or commission decisions which oblige member states, sometimes also private actors, to explore how to pursue their preferred goals in ways compatible with European law, but without imposing specific hierarchical solutions. And in terms of constitutional law, Oliver Gerstenberg has written very eloquently about this. And in terms of competition law enforcement, Janis Svetja has very interestingly studied the Commission's practice of provisional and monitorable commitments, which actually Bernardo also mentioned in the case of Google. In a transnational context, penalty defaults often involve threats of exclusion from key markets through some combination of multilateral sanctions, unilateral regulation, and private consumer boycotts or civil society campaigns. And particularly, but not exclusively, in transnational experimentalist regimes, these exclusion threats are often accompanied by some kind of capacity building support to assist weaker actors in meeting the required standards. And one example of this comes from the Montreal Protocol. This has been elaborated by Sable and Victor in their new book, in which on the one hand, there's a process of identifying what are the substances which are dangerous to the ozone layer and prohibiting trade in them, but also supporting developing countries through a multilateral fund in order to bear the costs of implementing these changes. We see similar kinds of things in EU external food safety regulation and also in the voluntary partnership agreements of the EU Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Program that I studied myself. Now, apart from its novelty and possible significance, why should we care about this? And I think the core reason is that government's processes of this type, under the right circumstances, have a number of normatively attractive features. First of all, they accommodate diversity by adapting general goals to varying local contexts, rather than imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. Secondly, they offer a framework for coordinated learning through disciplined comparison of different approaches to advancing broad common goals. I would say maybe it's important to emphasize the difference between experimentation and experimentalism. It's this systematic, comparative, recursive character that distinguishes experimentalism from trial, error, uncontrolled experimentation. Thirdly, it offers a dynamic accountability mechanism for shared commitments based on mutual monitoring, joint evaluation, and peer review. Finally, there is corrigibility by design, which I've already emphasized. That is, that problems identified in one phase of implementation can be corrected in the next iteration. So it does not require an omniscient central planner to pursue ambitious goals. Now, I think it's also important to emphasize the scope conditions for this kind of governance. They're very, I mean, there are a number of conditions that are relatively minimalist, they're relatively broad. The first and most important is strategic uncertainty. And we already heard about this from Bernardo and others. So this is the idea that policymakers don't know their precise goals or how best to achieve them in advance. A second important scope condition, which Bernardo also mentioned, is a multipolar or polyarchic distribution of power in which no single actor is able to impose their preferred solution without taking account of others' views. A third, and this is pretty connected to strategic uncertainty, I would say, is diversity, which makes it difficult to identify universal solutions and impose and enforce uniform rules. And finally, interdependence. You have to have at least a sufficient amount of interdependence to motivate a search for joint solutions to common problems. If you're not interdependent, you can learn from each other separately, but you're not going to set up a joint governance problem. Now, I think that we can say that for each of these conditions, some kind of intermediate level of these conditions fosters experimentalist governance. So you can have too much as well as too little of each for the classic experimentalist architecture to thrive. If you're in a total state of strategic uncertainty, you have no idea of how to move forward, you can't reach a common problem definition, you're not going to go anywhere. If you think you already know what to do, as Bernardo emphasized in talking about the commission, then you're going to be concerned about how do you get compliance with the solutions you've already chosen, rather than pursuing a process of joint inquiry. And I'll say something about the other scope conditions in a moment. Okay, so that was the introductory overview in kind of where we had gotten to by around 2010. Now I want to talk about various kinds of theoretical and empirical extensions based on work that I have been doing in many cases with people either online or in this room. And the first is something that Bernardo has already mentioned, which is the emergence of a new architectural variant combining synchronic uniformity and diachronic experimentalism. So in some cases, under conditions of high interdependence coupled with high uncertainty, concern for the integrity of integrated markets has led to the creation of a single set of harmonized but provisional rules, revisable through ongoing review of implementation experience. And we call this a simplified experimentalist architecture. So in such architectures, framework rules and procedures may be progressively specified and discretion for lower level actors at any given moment narrow. But the rules and procedures themselves remain contestable in light of local application. And the revisions based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience provide a crucial source of improvement and adaptability for the system as a whole. The examples that we've studied in depth, Bernardo and I separately and together, are from EU electricity and banking regulation. Let me give an example, a little bit more detail from the case that I have studied, which is particularly the single supervisory mechanism, or SSM, for banking union. As many of you will know, this was created following the global financial and euro crisis as something attached to the European Central Bank. And the core goal was to break up the cozy and destructive relationship between banks and their national supervisors. It was thought to have contributed to both of those crises. Now, the ECB, as you may know, has final authority over banking licenses within the Eurozone. It directly supervises the largest banks, and it can take over supervision of less significant institutions. SI stands for significant institutions, from the national authorities where it deems it necessary. And importantly, the SSM seeks to enforce uniform rules, standards, and procedures across the banking union, which its leaders consider necessary to avoid regulatory arbitrage and ensure a level playing field. So here we have aspirationally synchronic uniformity of regulation or supervision. However, when we look more closely at the SSM, we find that all major decisions must be approved by its supervisory board, in which the national competent authorities account for 21, 27 votes. And if you read the SSM regulation, you find that it basically says that whenever you see the word ECB, it really means the supervisory board. So the supervisory board is, for all effects, intents and purposes, the exercise of the authority given to the ECB. All major initiatives and policies, including the supervisory model itself, have been developed through joint ECB national authority networks based on a deliberative comparison of national practices. The big banks, significant authorities, are overseen by joint supervisory teams of ECB and national officials, and this is supported by extensive central benchmarking. And so you get this combination of deep local knowledge with a broad comparative perspective. The rules, practices, and methodologies are regularly revised through ongoing peer review by mixed groups of ECB and national officials at multiple levels. And very importantly, the frontline supervisors can and do regularly propose revisions based on local implementation. Experience in these events fed through the networks into the decision-making process in an annual cycle. And I think this model reflects the SSM's deliberate efforts to adapt its rules, methods, and procedures to banks' diverse business models on the one hand, and to update all this in response to rapidly changing markets and technologies. So in this sense, we claim it's a good example of diachronic experimentalism. Now, we identified a similar architecture combining uniform detailed rules made and revised experimentally in EU electricity regulation. And Bernardo and I concluded that both cases support the view that under conditions of high interdependence coupled with high uncertainty, uniform rules and practices can be accepted as effective and legitimate by member states, provided first that they're applied in contextually sensitive ways, and secondly, that they're regularly revised through deliberative procedures in which national officials themselves participate. And we concluded more broadly, at least as a conjecture, that far from uniformity and experimentalism being mutually antithetical, as we might have thought from the original experimentalist architecture, diachronic experimentalism may actually be a necessary condition for synchronic uniformity of regulation within a diverse polity like the EU. And Bernardo and I are going to explore this conjecture through research on other regulatory policy domains within a new project that's being launched by the Central European University and the Herrigel School on managing diversity within integrated markets. Now let me describe or introduce another architectural variant. Here we go into the transnational sphere, what I've called joined up transnational regimes. So experimentalism, we started to discuss this yesterday, is in principle well suited to transnational domains because there's no overarching sovereign, there's no hierarchy ultimately to impose and enforce common goals and rules. And also the diversity of local conditions makes uniform fixed rules even less feasible than in domestic settings. But at the same time, and I think this is something that Brian was alluding to, the very polyarchy and diversity that make experimentalist governance attractive can also make it hard to get a transnational experimentalist regime off the ground. So there are too many participants with sharply different views. It's hard to get initial agreement on common goals. And a single powerful player or set of players may be able to veto other proposed solutions, even if they can't impose their own. Anyone who has been following what's been happening in international organizations and multilateral fora, I hope will recognize those two problems. Fortunately, in such cases, transnational experimentalist regimes can also be assembled or joined up piece by piece from elements of loosely coupled regime complexes operating through multiple pathways and mechanisms. Developed this argument and work with Christine Overgast on forestry. And this is also, by the way, in using slightly different language, the message of Sable and Victor about how to fix the climate. The first thing is to break up the problems, the overarching problem of climate change, into smaller, more tractable problems to set coalitions of the willing to work on them, and then to figure out ways to join up those solutions and link them to the broader UNFCCC framework. Okay, let me again give an example from my own recent research on the emergence of a joined up timber legality, transnational timber legality. A commonplace to say that there's still no overarching global forest governance regime 30 years after the failure of proposals for a binding international forest convention at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. But I've argued that something like a joined up transnational regime with pronounced experimentalist features has nonetheless emerged over the past decade, maybe 2 decades, through productive interactions between multiple public and private initiatives across different geographic regions and levels of governance. And the way I analyze it is this regime is centered around the EU's Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade, or FLEGT initiative, for combating illegal logging and promoting sustainable forest governance. And I would argue that that initiative has something closer to a classic experimentalist governance architecture. Now, in what sense can we talk about a joined up transnational regime? Okay, I want to emphasize 4 elements, and they do correspond in some ways to features of the classic architecture, experimentalist architecture. First of all, growing convergence around a shared problem definition and accompanying norms, principles, and framework goals for combating illegal logging. Secondly, the diffusion of mutually reinforcing and often cross-referencing rules and standards across different jurisdictions and schemes, both public and private. Thirdly, the progressive institutionalization of practical cooperation and coordination to advance these goals, including information sharing, alignment of regulatory approaches, collaborative training, and enforcement activities in transnational networks of enforcement authorities, but also working with NGOs, with business associations and others. And finally, an increasing focus on monitoring, review, and revision of practices, procedures, and programs at multiple levels, informed by comparison of implementation experience across jurisdictions and schemes. And I think it's worth drawing attention to some of the key mechanisms for joining up this regime, which, by the way, I think also travel at least potentially more widely to others. Some of these are distinctively experimentalist, others are not. One is what Oren Perez has called ensemble regulation, that is normative and enforcement externalities of cross-referencing of rules and standards across public regulation and private certification schemes. Secondly, recursive learning through peer review of implementation experience within transnational enforcement networks. Thirdly, public oversight and review of private certification and national legality verification schemes, potentially leading to a process of benchmarking for equivalence, which we also see in other fields like food safety. And finally, the penalty default effect of the EU timber regulation and other public timber legality regulations on third country exporters and multinational companies. And here, I think we can say it's important to draw attention to the role of multilateral institutions and goals as a key potential source of legitimacy for what Joanne Scott has called contingent unilateralism, or what Bernard Hoekman and Chuck Sable have called open plurilateral agreements. And these, in turn, legitimate the penalty defaults, which help to drive the joined up transnational experimentalist regime more generally. Now, let me introduce another extension, another issue which Mark and Bernardo already mentioned yesterday. And that is the question of temporal sustainability. Is experimentalist governance self-limiting or self-reinforcing? And here we start from the view that strategic uncertainty is a key scope condition, the key scope condition for experimentalist governance, but that might vary over time. And we explore this question of whether experimentalism is self-limiting or self-reinforcing through an empirical analysis of over time evolution of EU electricity regulation, drawn on Bernardo's thesis and later research. And we concluded that this supports the view that experimentalist governance is self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting, though other outcomes are possible. And here you see what we identified as 4 possible pathways. One in which strategic uncertainty is endogenously reduced by experimentalist governance. Governance actors become satisfied with the solutions developed experimentally, and then they try to implement them hierarchically. A second would be that they do that at one moment, but then strategic uncertainty unexpectedly reemerges, and they may stumble back into experimentalist governance. Here we were building on a concept introduced by Ronny de Burka, who said, it isn't always that actors deliberately adopt experimentalist architectures, but they may stumble into them as they try to elaborate architectures designed for another purpose. A third pathway is that strategic uncertainty becomes more narrowly focused, and you get nested experimentalist governance. So you arrive at a solution, but the solution opens new questions, and within that, let's say, design space, the actors explore how to elaborate it further experimentally, and in a kind of constant reiteration of the experimentalist cycle. And the final pathway we identified is that the actors recognize that strategic uncertainty is pervasive, and they create a multi-purpose experimentalist architecture to make and revise rules, policies, and practices. And just to cut to the chase, in the electricity case, we found only examples of pathway 3 and pathway 4, which support the idea of experimentalist governance being self-reinforcing. Now, I want to introduce another possibility, which is only beginning to be studied. And this is the idea of deliberately reducing strategic uncertainty. So it could be that policy actors might deliberately seek to reduce strategic uncertainty rather than to adapt and adjust to it. And so they might prefer hierarchical rather than experimentalist governance architectures, even where the latter already exists. And a partial example of this is a very ambitious and important proposal from the European Commission to combat external deforestation. And it focuses on reducing the EU's deforestation footprint by excluding agricultural commodities produced on recently deforested land from the EU market through mandatory due diligence for importers. And the governance arrangements for this are aimed at reducing uncertainty for businesses and national authorities by relying on a standard international definition of deforestation, one size fits all, verifying it through external satellite data, and benchmarking countries unilaterally by the level of risk that they might face. And the original proposal from DG Environment also envisaged abolishing the flagged VPAs, despite acknowledging that these have materially improved forest governance in producer countries. The focus was more on this clean hands for the EU than actually tackling the root causes of illegal logging and deforestation. Now, here, a hopeful sign is the interaction with one of the other key scope conditions of experimentalism, and that is polyarchy. So if we analyze the policymaking process, and I have been, following this very closely and also advising some of the NGOs who have been participating in it, so a kind of inside view of this. And what I would say is pushback from other DGs within the Commission, the European Parliament, some member states, partner countries, has led to a revised proposal which preserves the flagged VPAs and envisages an enhanced role for bilateral forest partnerships in implementing the regulation. So that's already just in the Commission's proposed regulation. It still has to be amended by the Parliament and by the member states. And it's likely that the final, when it becomes law, it will look still different from the proposed regulation. And so my interpretation of this is that the polyarchic distribution of power in the EU's internal decision-making process has thus blocked a unilateral effort to impose a fully hierarchical governance architecture in the name of reducing uncertainty. And it remains to be seen how far the amended regulation, once adopted, will reopen space for experimentalist arrangements through bilateral collaboration with producer countries. I think if you care about fighting deforestation, and if you care about the legitimacy, the external legitimacy of the EU's own actions, this kind of partnership is absolutely crucial. And my last master's thesis student at the UvA has written a very good thesis about this. And actually within the Gem Diamond Marie Curie consortium, I have a new PhD student who will take that work forward beginning next month. So That's nice. Okay, now let me apply the same approach to the EU's recovery and resilience facility, the RRF, which we've been talking about. And I think that in part, we can see the governance of the RRF as an attempt by the EU institutions and the member states to reduce rather than adapt to strategic uncertainty. So as most of you will know, the RRF is the flagship of the next generation EU post-COVID recovery plan. It comprises up to 673 billion euros in grants and loans to member states financed through common borrowing. To access these funds, the member states must submit national resilience and recovery plans with very specific targets and milestones. These are linked to the climate and digital transitions, supposed to account for 57% of the money, to the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and to the country-specific recommendations that member states have in the past received through the European semester. Now, the plans, targets, and milestones were formulated by member states. There's a big emphasis on ensuring national ownership, but they have to be approved by the Commission as well as by the Economic and Financial Committee and by the Council itself. Now, there's already a bunch of initial research, including by Vandenbroucke, Francesco Corti, another former student of mine, Eckes Imanis, and I read this as showing that the Commission has exerted considerable but not overwhelming influence on the content of the national plans through bilateral negotiations. And this, there are, of course, variations across member states. Probably the main sources of variations are the relative size of the funds, which increases the leverage of the Commission, and the administrative capacity of the member state, less capacity, more influence of the Commission. The disbursement of the funds is dependent on reaching agreed targets and milestones, again, monitored through the European semester, and they must be, payments must be approved by the Commission and ultimately also by the Economic and Financial Committee and the Council. This has been called performance-based management, and many people see this as a great breakthrough for the EU. And in relation really to your question about budgets, this is certainly a big development. So it appears from, again, the initial research that the process of negotiating the national plans has gone relatively smoothly, and that both the EU institutions and member states are broadly satisfied. Obviously, Hungary and Poland is an exception, and that has to do with the whole rule of law issue. But for me, it's unclear how performance-based management of RRF implementation can or will actually work in the face of the inevitable deviations from the agreed plans resulting from unanticipated problems and changing circumstances. And we already see this with rising energy prices, and I gather that governments are already proposing to postpone certain commitments to, for example, raising gas taxes for that reason. And so that raises the question of how much flexibility will the Commission allow for revision of the national plans, and on what basis? And I think I agree with what Erik said, that this is not designed to fail. So you know, the Commission will show some flexibility, but showing some flexibility is quite different from designing a process from the outset to deal with inevitable, unexpected contingencies. And in this respect, I think the design of the RRF is really very far from best practices internationally for managing large, complex projects under conditions of uncertainty. And that would be true both in private business, for example, what Sable and colleagues have called contracting for innovation in biotech, like between pharmaceutical companies and biotech startups and other sectors, and also best practice in public industrial policy. So if we look at things like the US ARPA-E for innovative energy projects, or Singapore's Prime Minister's delivery unit, Pemandu, what we see in all of these cases is that they establish some kind of experimentalist governance process for monitoring and revising initial plans in light of the problems encountered along the way. And that's something like that is what the EU would need if they're going to be in the business of spending these kinds of quantities of money. And in any event, David, Francesco, and Edgars and I have committed to doing a small policy study on governing the RF for the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, and we'll investigate the formulation, implementation, monitoring, and possible revision of the plans in 9 member states. We'll see what we really get to 9, but that's the idea. I'm relying on my energetic junior colleagues to make sure that that happens. Okay, now let me switch to gears to the last part on research challenges, and I hope I can do that in the 10 minutes that will still leave us time for discussion. Okay, because of its complex variant architectures, its contextual adaptations, and iterative temporal dynamics, experimentalist governance does not lend itself to standard large N research methods like constructing indices or scoreboards on the basis of quantitative indicators, nor box-ticking qualitative exercises, for example, focused on the 4 elements of the classic XG architecture. I mean, I would not like to see somebody try to come up with an experimentalist governance score, which we could then compare across countries or sectors and fit in also to statistical analysis. It also doesn't lend itself to median N methods like qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, whether in its crisp or fuzzy set form, because the truth table scores from which configurations of necessary and sufficient conditions are derived in QCA may actually change over time through comparative review and recursive revision of local practices and central goals, metrics, and procedures in light of one another. And it's pretty well known that QCA is especially sensitive to varying the set of cases and the characteristics of those cases. So for me, this brings us to the indispensability of in-depth case studies, and several people have already alluded to my personal affinity for this. I think there's no substitute for in-depth case studies of specific cases, using a combination of qualitative methods like interviewing, participant observation, documentary analysis. I've never tried focus groups, but they fit in this fine. To analyze the operation of governance, architectures, and action, identify the key mechanisms at work, and trace their evolution over time. This contextualized process tracing, in my view, is essential to eliminate false positives, cases which at first glance resemble the classic experimentalist architecture, and especially the first 2 steps, which are really very widespread, but which on closer inspection turn out to lack some of its key features, notably the recursive feedback from comparative review of implementation experience to revision of local practices and central procedures. And I would say that you often have to kiss a lot of frogs before you can find an experimentalist prince. That's what we experienced studying Dutch. youth care at the municipal level. And Gary was involved in a project with Chuck Sable and Pierre Holt Christensen studying offshore oil and gas safety. And they went to what looked like the most promising case, the Norwegian Petroleum Safety Authority. And they found that when they really got into it, it lacked some very important experimental features. I also think that these kinds of in-depth case studies are essential to eliminate false negatives and identify new variant architectures. And I revert to the example of the SSM. And this initially was widely but erroneously considered to be a case of the EU moving towards centralized hierarchical governance. And that was certainly my concern about it. And here I have to thank a series of my UVA master's students who did practitioner interviews, especially one Dhura Das, and who drew my attention from talking to these practitioners to the experimentalist features of the SSM, which I then went on to investigate more systematically myself. But obviously, and this is an issue that Erik raised in the last panel, this raises the problem of generalization. So indispensable through those such in-depth case studies are the researching experimentalist governance. They're not by themselves sufficient to support its theoretical claims about broader transformations of contemporary governance. Following a Bayesian logic, process tracing case studies like that of the evolution of EU electricity regulation enhance confidence in theoretical claims, such as that experimentalist governance is self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting, but can't prove them definitively. Extending the generalizability of such findings would thus require further process tracing analyses at similar levels of granularity across other policy domains within and beyond the EU, followed by systematic cross-case comparison. Similarly, identification of promising new forms of experimentalist governance, like the provision of customized social care services through integrated neighborhood teams in the Dutch city of Utrecht, which I haven't had a chance to talk about, or varying experimentalist architectures like the combination of synchronic uniformity with diachronic experimentalism. These could be said to offer preliminary proofs of concept suggestive of broader possibilities, but their incidence and relevance to contemporary governance need to be investigated through further case studies and comparative mapping exercises. Given the thorny problems of causal inference in studying experimentalist governance, what about experimental methods, increasingly seen as the gold standard for social science research? Here I'm calling this, can we research experimentalist governance experimentally? Now, I want to mention two studies. One is Daniel Ho's study of peer review of food safety inspection in two counties in the US state of Washington, including the one where Seattle is located. And through controlled experimental trials, Ho shows that peer review, supported by consultation with experts to clarify disagreements and training in revised standards, led to a systematic upward convergence in inspection assessment across cases. But notice here, while the RCT, random control trial approach, confirms the effectiveness. Sorry about that, of peer review. The real work of improving governance processes and outcomes depended on the new forms of deliberation and training developed during the course of the experiment, not on the RCT itself. The RCT just tells us whether it worked and what kinds of effects it had. Another recent study that uses experimental methods to explore the potential contribution of experimentalist governance to improve governance is the ACES pesticides project. There we use a pair of linked survey experiments in 6 member states to analyze public attitudes to reform of EU pesticide regulation. And this was done jointly with David van der Douwen, Theresa Kuhn, Maria Weimer, and also Martin Dibdal Jensen, research master's student. Now, in this study, we found, I would say to my pleasant surprise, that systematic post-authorization monitoring and review with the possibility of withdrawing pesticides from the market in case of unanticipated negative effects. This had by far the strongest effect on respondents' support for a random package of reform measures. And it also enhanced their willingness to accept a hypothetical authorization decision of glyphosate, the most controversial pesticide, which was opposed to their own prior expressed preference if post-authorization monitoring and review were included in the decision-making procedure. And here too, I would say, on the one hand, the experimentalist design of our study sheds convincing light on the potential contribution of post-authorization monitoring and review to rebuilding public support for EU pesticides regulation. But it's the design and implementation of the experimentalist governance methods which can be expected to do the real work of improving governance outcomes. And I think I'm going to cut myself short and I'll conclude in 1 or 2 slides, skipping the last perspective example for my future research. But I do want to hear from you rather than just talk to and at you. Okay. So I want to lay out a kind of strategy which responds to these challenges. So given the challenges of combining depth and breadth, a promising strategy for researching experimentalist governance involves what we can call an iterative abductive cycle between in-depth case studies and systematic comparative mapping and cross-case analysis. Now, we can, with this kind of approach, and this is sort of the beauty of experimentalist governance, you can start at either end of the spectrum. You can begin from a broad comparative mapping of governance arrangements in a specific policy domain, like the provision of capacitating social care services. And then you can zoom in on promising cases for deeper study. That's how we found youth care and Utrecht. And then you can zoom out again on the basis of insights gained from the case study to the wider comparative picture, which we're going to do now. Or you can do it in the reverse way. You can start with the promising case. This iterative research strategy, which arguably resembles the architecture of experimentalist governance itself, follows what we can call an abductive logic developed by the pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce before doing, in which theoretical propositions inspired by empirical observation are then systematized deductively and tested inductively in a cyclical process of inference to the best provisional explanation. And I guess this is where I should stop. I wanted to talk to you about a project on experimentalist regulation of uncertain risks, which tries to apply this approach. Here you can see some of the universe of cases that one could study. And again, one could start with a large-scale comparative mapping exercise. This could be a big collaborative team project like an ERC advanced grant, or one could start with some of the most promising cases and work upwards, and we'll see which of those I wind up doing in future ones.
So let's, why don't you have a seat, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
Hold the microphone.
Yeah, do that too.
Sit forward enough that people can see you.
Yeah, I'm just worried that the kind of light is directly.
Oh, yeah, that might be a bit much. So if you want, I'll turn off the.
Yeah, why don't you turn off
yeah.
the director?
Okay. Oh, no, I can do it. Okay. Amy.
So I'm happy for comment.
So Jonathan, I really appreciated the overview, and I realize we don't have enough time, and I feel bad asking the questions.
No, please.
On the matter of the SSM, I was a little bit curious. That was a very small detail of your overall presentation, but I just kept on thinking about it. My understanding of the SSM was that it was created because during the financial crisis, I was doing research at the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank freaked out because they had absolutely no way of knowing how bad anything was in any banking sector anywhere in the EU. And if the ECB were to do anything, they would sort of need to have at least the data. And so it turned out that not all national central banks were the regulators of the banking sector. Some places it's connected to the central bank, in other places it's a different regulatory agency. And it took them all this time to sort of find a way to at least collect that data so that they could communicate with one another. So although whether or not that's hierarchical or not hierarchical isn't really the problem that needed to be solved, the lack of this information, because the whole architecture of the EMU was sort of, it was monetary on central banks and monetary policy, and sort of economic was sort of macroeconomic policy coordination in the part of the very well known. But the part of regulating the financial sector was sort of implicit mutual recognition. If it sort of works in your country, we're not going to fuss with it. And only when it emerged that it was a problem, and you wouldn't even have